without problem. Sometimes it gives me a problem. It doesn't look like it's going to today.
Okay.
All right, says we are live on Facebook. So all right. And yeah, I see us up there. So we are ready to go. All right, everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us again at the SIU Alumni Association for another, I guess, a Thursday, Friday live chat that we've started doing during this whole quarantine period. I'm Caleb Hale. I'm the communications director for the Alumni Association and editor of SIU Alumni Magazine. Today, we've got an 89 and a 91 alumnus, Richard Jurek, who is with us up in the, this is the Chicagoland area, I suppose, and for better around that area. And Rich is going to introduce himself in a minute, but he's been a longtime enthusiast of the U.S. space program and of NASA and of pretty much anything that has to do with space and space exploration. And that's led him to some interesting opportunities in life. And he's authored 2 books around those topics over the last couple of years. So I'm gonna stop talking for a moment and let Richard introduce himself a little bit and talk a little bit about his time at SIU.
Thanks, Caleb. I really appreciate it. I want to thank everybody for joining us on the live stream. You're right, 89 grad, undergrad in English creative writing with a minor in advertising, and grad student, graduated in 91, also in English creative writing. And I would have to say that my time at SIU really prepared me for everything I've become and my ability to have a career, write books, and enjoy the life that I have. As an undergrad, I learned how to use language in the writing program. I worked at SIU Press, so a big shout out to Southern Illinois University Press, one of the great university presses in the country, a great catalog of books. I worked in the marketing department there, so I got exposure to marketing as a career. And then in graduate school, I was a graduate teaching assistant. And I learned to teach classes, get over my fear of public speaking, learn to create a communications plan, orchestrate a room, interact with people, divide people up into audiences. And so SIU became just a fundamental proving ground for my future. And more importantly, I met my future wife in graduate school. So she was an exchange student from Germany. We met in grad school. After I graduated, I followed her like a puppy dog over to Germany. Spent and lived 2 years there teaching English with the US military. We got married and came back, and leveraging what I learned at SIU, started a career in marketing. And so for the past quarter century, have worked as either a chief marketing officer or chief communications officer. And right now I actually wear both titles at a company in Oak Brook, Illinois. But during that whole time, I've always been a child of Apollo. You know, I grew up in the late 60s and early 70s, came of age when Apollo and space as a theme was a dominant theme in our society, and certainly for a kid. Growing up with television shows, whether it was, you know, Star Trek or Lost in Space, but also things like Carl Sagan's Cosmos, Star Wars, and all those other sort of byproducts of the space age, and had always had a fascination with it. And so it became a passion project for me. While I worked on my career, I would also research, write articles, collect things, and explore my passion of space as a space enthusiast and as a supporter of not only the US space program, but humanity's efforts to reach out to the stars.
Right. Well, yeah, and you've also got some receipts that you carried back with you from Carbondale as well. I noticed you have a few Quattros cups that you're I saw you
Yeah,
drink from. Those are diplomas are one thing, but that's the real proof that you.
this is a real proof. This is I can't tell you how much of my student loan money I probably paid off their mortgage. I'm sure, but this proves that I'm a diehard collector of all things because I have a whole cabinet filled with yellow Quatros cups. But every time I go back to campus, I have to visit Quatros. So a big shout out to the Wednesday Real Meal delivery deal people and Quatros Pizza.
All right. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how you mentioned that before, how you got into kind of collecting memorabilia from the space program, and I think you said it started when you wrote a letter to Neil Armstrong, junior high or grade school or somewhere around there.
Yeah, it was grade school, and again, growing up, really coming of age in the early '70s, born in the mid '60s, and then growing up in the early '70s. I was a collector at heart, so coins, stamps, autographs, and after school, when I discovered a thing called Who's Who in our local library, I would go there and I would throw a dart. Carl Sagan, Neil Armstrong. Alec Guinness, Obi-Wan Kenobi from Star Wars. And I would get their addresses and I would write them letters and I would get autographed pictures and feedback and I would start a connection with these people. And so throughout my youth, I collected those things. Fast forward later in life, have a job, have a little disposable income. And I learned that you could actually start collecting and acquiring things from the US space program. And not only things like autographed pictures and documentation and other things, but things that actually flew in space that were part of the astronauts' private and personal collections, things that had great emotional meaning to them. So over the last almost quarter century, I've been acquiring these items as a side passion, as a collection. And like most collectors, started out grabbing anything I could. And then over time, rediscovering my love for numismatic items, for coins and stamps and paper money and autographs, and combine those to really sort of specialize in collecting space-flown numismatic items. So I have the world's largest collection of space-flown $2 bills, for example, medallions, coins. It turns out the astronauts and the ground support crew were also collectors at heart. And they would take these little mementos with them that meant a lot. And when they came back, they'd certify them. They were on the official manifests, the lists that were allowed to be carried, so you can track them back by serial number in the case of paper money and other things. Mm-hmm. And one thing led to another, and as collections want to do, they pile up. For those who might be interested, I keep a virtual museum out on the web called jeffersonspacemuseum.com for my $2 bill collection. It was recently featured in a documentary called The $2 Bill Movie. It's all about the history of $2 bills. But that collecting really is a byproduct of a desire to find out more, to research these artifacts, to have a connection point with the astronauts themselves and the ground support crew, to be able to sit with them and talk to them and find out more about how things happen behind the scenes. And it was through collecting that I got to meet astronauts, that I got to meet Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Gene Cernan, the last man to walk on the moon, and many others, and gained access to their insight and their stories. And one of the things that became a byproduct of that was bringing my professional background to the table. The astronauts always get asked the same question. How do you go to the bathroom in space? What did it feel like? All those other things. But as a marketer and a communications officer for companies, I wanted to know, were they scripted? Did they get media training? Were words put in their mouth? Did Neil Armstrong really write the first words that he spoke when he stepped down on the surface? And how did NASA, how did this organization, the people that would be in my professional role, convert what was once a secret military project into an open, global communal experience that had a massive impact on the world, and in fact still has an impact on us to this day. And it was asking those questions and diving into those through my access to these folks as a collector that eventually led to me writing some articles, publishing some articles, and then meeting up with my co-author on Marketing the Moon, the first book I wrote in 2014, David Merriman Scott, and he's a best-selling author of business books. David comes from a business background as well, but also an avowed space geek like myself. We would meet down in Florida at a thing called the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation, where we would go every year. It would raise money for STEM research, then at the same time grant us access to the astronauts. And we would ask them these questions about the marketing and the communication aspects of the program, and they would light up because it was questions they really rarely got. And so we found ourselves deeply engaged in conversation. And it was David who turned to me and said, you know what, while these guys are still alive, and while the original public affairs people like Jack King and Doug Ward and many others are still around, and some of the reporters that covered Apollo in the day, we need to document this. We need to research it, and we need to put a book together on their contributions to the space program. Because everyone views it as an engineering achievement or as a geopolitical achievement in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And very few, if any, had ever looked at it from a marketing and communications perspective. So when we wrote the book and we published it, we were blown away by the response. It led eventually into it moved towards the development of a film called Chasing the Moon, which came out last year, and a companion book by the director and writer of that. It started with Marketing the Moon, but went off in a totally different direction. But it also spurred an interest from folks within NASA, the folks who work in the communications arm, and among the contractors in private space who worked in marketing and communications. We heard finally a book about us.
Right.
And the truth of the matter is 400,000 people worked on Apollo. 400,000 people helped us get to the moon. And all anybody ever really read about were the astronauts, and maybe a handful of engineers, maybe a Von Braun or somebody like that, or Kennedy. But the gift that keeps on giving from Apollo is that with 400,000 people working on it, there are 400,000 stories that hadn't been told. And
let's
we were gratified by that response.
Right. Let's stop for a moment and just talk about what, I mean, it was a feat in itself to, I think, sell this to the public. I think history kind of lets, it pretty much just kind of lets people think, well, the public was 100% behind this. They were like, oh yeah, let's do this. Let's go to the moon. Let's spend millions of dollars in space, when really that was not the case. Much like today, there were many problems that people felt could have been addressed more immediately right here on Earth, but it was kind of a hurdle for NASA, especially the people responsible for selling this project, to get it going. So tell me a little bit about what was the climate of, what was kind of the public relations climate with NASA back in those days.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The main reason we went to the moon, and no one should doubt that, is we were in a geopolitical Cold War race with the Soviet Union. It was a test of wills around technology and might, and a military concern around the person who has the high ground has the advantage, and you can't get any higher than the moon looking back down on Earth. And so it started there. But over time, it diverged historically in a very important point that touches on the exact thing you're talking about, which is the Soviet program stayed a closed military program. You only heard about or had exposure to what they wanted to tell you about. Whether it succeeded or failed, you weren't quite sure what was happening. Eisenhower formed NASA, took it out of the military, and created it as a civilian organization with a mandate in the late 50s to openly communicate to the world what they were doing. Success and failure would be available to the public like no other enterprise, and it became an extension of American geopolitics. But what that meant was NASA had a responsibility now to communicate and respond in real time. And NASA pioneered, and as David and I point out in Marketing the Moon, a concept that marketers today use. They call it brand journalism, where journalists take a newsroom approach to communicating the facts as opposed to marketing a specific angle or spin. And the folks, early on in NASA communications, legends like Julian Shearer, Paul Haney, took a brand journalism approach, and they made it possible. They fought the battles internally to get cameras aboard and live television, to give reporters access, to encourage the astronauts to give interviews and to go out and speak to the people and create that time so that we ended up going with them to the moon in real time. They didn't just go there, take some pictures, come back, and 2 weeks later develop it and publish it. They took us with. And it was that bravery and that open program, which was curated by a handful of public affairs stalwarts within NASA, that created this global communal experience that we all now reflectively look back on. And it made possible that 500 million people around the planet watched the lunar landing, watched the first steps by Neil Armstrong on the moon. And so we document that in marketing the moon.
And for one of history's most well documented events, there are still doubters out there. It definitely wouldn't have worked if they had just gone up there, taken a handful of photos, and come back to show people and say, "Yeah, look, we did this." So in some ways, you're saying NASA was not only ahead in technology; they were kind of decades ahead in the whole content marketing area that people are just now kind of, or brands now are kind of getting on board with.
Yeah, and I've always argued that in many ways, Apollo is one of the main drivers of the fourth wave of the Industrial Revolution. It was that massive amount of investment into technology, into software development and communications development and circuitry development, and the 400,000 workers who worked on the program that got us to the moon and developed the satellite technology, the telemetry technology, shrank cameras, set up these expectations of real-time access to live video feeds that then inspired a whole generation of kids out in a place called California, be it Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or any of the other beneficiaries of this massive funding of technological research that brought computers into our houses and eventually gave birth to the cell phone. We still benefit from that massive decade in time when we flooded research institutes, when we paid for and invested in projects to get us to the moon that then had knockoff benefits in basic research and science that have led us to this, hyper-connected digital world. And so I firmly believe that's the biggest legacy of the Apollo generation. And it's something, again, that the communications folks, the public affairs folks at NASA were at the vanguard of. And still to this day, some of the best social media marketing happens at NASA. And it's one of the strongest brands in the world, whether public brand or private corporate brand. The NASA brand itself has an ironclad reputation, is worth hundreds of millions of dollars in brand value.
Right. And yeah, they do carry some weight behind their name. You hear, NASA's associated with top minds in the world. Basically the cutting edge technology that is out there. So yeah, even when they, in the years when they might not necessarily be at the forefront of the public mind, they're still at the back of it as kind of the premier, or one of the premier institutions of, minds and technology.
Yeah, one of the principal benefits of the Apollo program was the further development of our industrial base, things we learned in the program. And every dime that we spent on space was spent here on Earth. And that magnified into the economy many-fold. And it helped us gain advantages that we couldn't even fathom. You couldn't predict that eventually a cell phone. Now, other influences, of course, were part of that, but the push towards shrinking cameras, the push towards communication networks, the push towards convergence of circuitry and video and audio and the ability to do the things that we can do with a cell phone and the automation and the computer programming and all of those other things were really driven by those major investments during Apollo that helped steer the ship and perhaps get us there quicker than we ever would have before. And we see those people, those fellow children of Apollo, Elon Musk creating SpaceX, Jeff Bezos from Amazon creating Blue Origin, the people who are going to help us get back to the moon, Richard Branson, who is going to help tourists go into space and maybe finally get us suborbital airplane transport so we can get to London in 45 minutes instead of in 6 hours. Those things that are happening now are from children of the Apollo generation who were direct beneficiaries not only of that science, but the inspiration that happened during Apollo. From sitting in front of TV sets and watching those rockets launch and seeing science fiction become science fact.
And then on your next book, you did go into the life of one engineer at NASA. The next book you did, which I think came out earlier this year.
Yeah, it's called The Ultimate Engineer. It's the story of one of the principal movers behind the scenes who, without this individual, we would not have arguably had a lunar landing as a goal for NASA. And it could be argued that NASA itself might not even have come together in the way it did. And it certainly may not have survived the post-Apollo drop-off in interest that happened after the program. Yet no one knows this gentleman's name. Very few people have any understanding of who he was. Yet he was seminal. He was the ghost in the machine at the agency from even its earliest days and its inception to setting its strategic goals, to successfully getting to the moon, and then navigating the post-Apollo world to where we're at today. And he achieved all of this in just 58 years of a very short life that was cut short by cancer. And he achieved in one life what would take many people 5 lifetimes to achieve. I like the underdog stories. I like the stories of the communications people behind the scenes who helped make the astronauts global rock stars. And I gravitate towards people like George Lowe, who were instrumental behind the scenes, but never sought out the attention or the glory for themselves. These were purpose-driven people who have a ton of lessons to learn from on what makes for a satisfying career, what makes for unselfish contribution to a goal bigger than yourself. And through that life, achieving more than you ever could have achieved if you just selfishly focused on yourself and, dollars and cents definitions of success. Plus, he has just a fascinating backstory in his life. Growing up in Austria in a very wealthy family that had Jewish heritage. And so when the Anschluss came and the Nazis marched in, they lost everything. They escaped just a few weeks before Kristallnacht and eventually immigrated to the United States. He studied engineering in Troy, New York at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and went to work for the predecessor agency of NASA, the NACA. And it was there that he met and started to work with people like Abe Silverstein and Bob Gilruth and Max Faget, and where he first met Neil Armstrong when he was a test pilot on the X-15 program. And so one thing led to another, and he was brought to Washington to help form NASA and create the first missions and programs for the agency.
And he was pretty instrumental early on in the program when the Apollo program kind of fell into disaster after the fire on the Apollo 1. Tell a little bit about how he kind of kept things going after that setback.
Well, George Lowe was considered the original moon zealot within NASA. In the earliest days when it was trying to decide what its long-term goals should be, Lowe behind the scenes was really pounding the table for a lunar landing. He knew that it would be very difficult, but he also viewed it as a goal that would be worth both the risk and the cost, that it would stretch our technology and our abilities to a level that we would get more out of it than we put into it. And so he really felt strongly that it was a national goal that we needed to strive for, that we could get the most out of. And so behind the scenes, he kept pushing for that. And he rose in management. He was the first head of human spaceflight for NASA at the time. And he helped shepherd the Mercury program. He testified in front of Congress. He helped push for a lunar landing. The report that Kennedy based his decision on, to make the decision to go to the moon and land there in a decade. So behind the scenes, he was always doing that work, but he wasn't working as a true, what he would have called dirty hands engineer. He was not involved in the actual designing and building of the spacecraft, more on the administration and strategy side. And then there was the Apollo 1 fire, which in 1967, January 1967, killed the 3 crew members on the pad. They asphyxiated in a flash fire that happened in the capsule. And there are many reasons for why that happened, but it shocked the agency. It shocked the American people. It made people in Congress question whether this program should even continue. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of things wrong with the spacecraft because we were pushing against a goal, trying to get it done fast. And changes were happening that weren't being communicated. And there was a lot of doubt and there was a lot of anger and suspicion. And NASA turned to the one man that they had confidence could get it done, and that was George Lowe. And on a normal organization chart, it looks like he took a step down. He went from upper management all the way down into program management, but he was never the type of person who thought about where he sat in the org chart. He was the type of person that thought about, what do I need to do that can add the most value to what we're trying to achieve? And so he became the Apollo program manager. He came in and he whipped the program into shape. I go through chapter and verse on how he achieves that in our book, The Ultimate Engineer, which is a phenomenal achievement in and of itself, and got us back on schedule. And not only that, made some of the boldest and bravest decisions within the Apollo program. He was the person, for example, who decided to take Apollo 8 to the moon on lunar orbit while the lunar module wasn't ready yet, which effectively broke the back of the Russian space program by us reaching the moon, humans reaching the moon before the end of the decade. And he worked as Apollo program manager until we landed on the moon with Apollo 11. And then he handed off the reins and went back to administration, went back to Washington to help chart the course for a post-Apollo world for NASA.
You know, it's a difficult thing to, specifically one of the most difficult things, I think, to try to effectively promote to the public is a scientific procedure like this. I mean, we see it even right now with what we're going through with the COVID-19 pandemic. The science behind it is very difficult to get people to believe in and trust the science, because people think science is just everything's supposed to fall in place exactly as you expect it to, when that's not what the process is. It's a process of learning and discovery. And, you know, if it doesn't look like it's going right, you can lose a lot of people early on with you can lose a lot of public trust with what you're going through. So tie it back to what's going on today. Yeah, setbacks like that, it's very easy to, you know, to lose everything when things like that occur.
Well, and it's easy to forget when you have a lot of successful flights that space flight is inherently dangerous.
Right.
Everything out in space is designed to try and kill you, right? Whether it's the lack of atmosphere, whether it's the different pressures, radiation, heat, temperatures, heat and cold, and rapid temperature changes. It's just a brutal environment, and people forget that. And we've seen it during the shuttle. We saw it during Apollo. The Soviets saw it with their Soyuz spacecraft, where they had a number of cosmonauts die. Virgin Galactic had that problem with the death of a test pilot. And it does shake people's not only enthusiasm, but belief in the system. And it's a testament to the people who do this, to the men and women who are willing to strap themselves into these machines and to take on those risks, because without those risks, there can't be progress. And they do it to try and advance our capabilities, to advance our understanding. And they're not just doing it for the thrill of it, although there may be some of that. They're doing that to explore, expand our knowledge base, and to advance us as a society and as human beings, because we eventually have to move out to the stars.
And I mean, even after you do it, even after you have it, you feel you have it fairly down, there were still reminders along the way that it's dangerous. The Challenger in '86 and Columbia in 2003, those were reminders that, hey, there's a reason all the life happens down in the on Earth for there, because it's not hospitable up there in space. So the prospect of going in between is a dangerous prospect.
Well, and that's the importance of books like The Ultimate Engineer, like Marketing the Moon, and obviously for historians on studying the past. What's the old saw? If you don't know the past, you're doomed to repeat it. And in many ways, if you look at those accidents, a lot of the lessons that George Lowe learned while being the Apollo program manager came back to bite us once again, as the agency itself forgot those lessons as time went on, as people like Lowe left the agency and newer people came on board. During Apollo 1, there were three things that he talked about and that I explore in the book. One is building in redundancy and a solid test regime within the development of the spacecraft is critical. And sometimes you have to slow schedules down and add to budgets in order to do the type of testing and build in the type of redundancy necessary to safely get into space. But his two operating philosophies that came out of Apollo 1 was paying excruciating attention to detail. And his example was with the Apollo 1 door. One of the reasons the astronauts asphyxiated and died in that capsule was it took minutes to open that capsule door, because it was designed perfectly for what an engineer would want, for the door not to open accidentally in space, but it was not designed appropriately if you had to get out of the capsule quickly. And so asking the right questions became paramount to Lowe. Was this door designed appropriately? Yes. But was it designed appropriately if we had a problem on the launch pad? No. And so developing a focus on detail and a focus of learning to ask the right questions. If you look at the things that happened with Challenger, asking the right question. What was the coal doing to those rings? Was it safe to launch on that morning? Paying attention to that small detail, this tiny little O-ring that became a factor that cost those lives. Same thing with the foam falling off the fuel tank, fuel tank at liftoff, and its impact on the tiles. Yes, a small piece of detail that was happening flight after flight, but did people and engineers ask the right questions in terms of the damage it could cause and the danger it proposed? So studying people like George Lowe and studying the work of people like in the public affairs department in Marketing the Moon are instrumental for those folks today who are trying to get back to the moon and onto Mars and beyond.
And going into that, let's talk a little bit about some of the work you've done with NASA, given some of the experience that what you covered with Marketing the Moon, because the obviously the space exploration program isn't done yet. There are still future aspirations out there. What things are we looking at for the next decade, and kind of what have you been talking with them about in terms of getting that kind of thing promoted, generating the public interest again?
Yeah, well, I've never worked for NASA, and I'm not like a paid consultant for what NASA has always done, even from its earlier days, has reached out to industry, has touched base with visionaries as we marketing the moon, whether it's reaching out to Walt Disney or reaching out to artists and authors and visionaries. They also are very aware of what historians are doing and the stories that are being written. And I think the biggest contribution that David and I did was writing a book like Marketing the Moon that elevated the contributions and the importance of the communications in marketing PR within the space program to a front of the pipeline discussion, as opposed to something that happens as an afterthought. When you concentrate too much on the engineering, you can lose sight of the important role that the communications function plays in generating enthusiasm, generating support, in communicating your successes, explaining your failures, and keeping those people who their tax dollars pay your salaries engaged in the activities that you're doing. And my co-author and I were invited by NASA last year to present at headquarters lessons learned during Apollo, but not just lessons learned, but how they transfer to the latest generation. And a couple of the that I observed and saw was that, number one, the current NASA administrator and all the people working in communications there, they get it. They are cutting edge and leading edge in terms of communications. They have images that the Apollo folks never had for this generation that's going out. And I'll give you one example, Caleb. If you look at the social media activity of NASA, it dominates its communications platform. The NASA Twitter handle alone has 37 million followers. And they have all these other Twitter handles, Facebook handles, Instagram, TV, all these other channels. But if you just think about that 37 million, where NASA can directly communicate to the world and engage a fandom and an audience in what they're doing. Think back to during Apollo. At the peak of Life magazine, which was one of the biggest magazines at the time that NASA had a contract with to tell the astronaut stories, it peaked out at a little over 6 million in circulation, 6.8 million in 1968 and 69 at the time that we landed on the moon. They've already have 6 times that audience just with their Twitter handle. And through their development and curation of these audiences, NASA has built in a massive fan base and a global experience already. One of the things that we were talking about with them is not forgetting that and making sure that they leverage it. We learned from some of the communications folks that they were still battling fights that they had won 50 years before. How to get a camera on, to remind the engineers that we need to take the people with us. The branding of it. The perception was that SpaceX and Blue Origin were advancing faster than NASA. Yet a number of their missions were being done under contract for NASA. And when a rocket would go up, you'd see the SpaceX logo. You never saw the NASA logo. And so just putting a spotlight on the importance of the role of communicating and engaging audiences and helping to elevate that, I think, has been the most important contribution that we could make. And I don't want to take anything away from the people at NASA who are doing that hard work and who are pioneering new methods of generating excitement and interest, because they have some of the best marketers and communicators in the world working at NASA. But not only at NASA, they're working at SpaceX, they're working at Blue Origin, they're working at Lockheed, they're working at Boeing. All of these people are creating an ecosystem that are generating excitement like we've never seen before. It's a renaissance in interest in spaceflight that we're seeing going on. And the other thing is, it's very diverse. During Apollo, it was trained test pilots who became astronauts. It was mostly white males who were working on the program. That people's background had major contributions, but people weren't learning about them at the time. We've learned about them now through books like Hidden Figures and the attention to important people of color and of diverse backgrounds and skill sets like the marketers and the communicators have done. But it's opened up an entire world for people, for their own passions and their own perspectives to get involved. And I think by focusing on things like we did with Marketing the Moon, or like I'm doing with The Ultimate Engineer, people are finding exciting careers and exciting stories that they weren't aware of before.
It's good you bring up the diversity because we know the first Saluki in space was Joan Higginbotham, who was a African American woman, 2006 with the Space Shuttle Discovery. So obviously our first, we're happy to say our first graduate in space was someone from a diverse background that represents that diversifying who can be part of this going forward.
Yeah, and NASA's stated goal for the Artemis program, which is the return to the moon. So the students and the folks who are involved now, like I was back during the Apollo days, I call myself a child of the Apollo generation. They're going to be the children of the Artemis generation, and NASA has committed that the commander of that mission is a woman, right? And it's we're going to rely on a lot of international partners to get to the moon, and we're going to have a huge public-private partnership in doing that. And so the excitement for a broad swath of the population is there. And NASA is working very hard to engage those audiences. And you see it on social media. You see a diverse background of people who are enthusiasts and supporters who are getting involved. And it's exciting to see. And for me, what I'm looking forward to in the future when I'm an old man in the rocking chair looking back is those future impacts on our industrial base, on our society, by these children of the Artemis generation. What will this investment in going back to the moon in space exploration reveal for us and bear fruit for us 10, 15, 20 years down the line, like we're experiencing now from the inspiration of Apollo? It'll be mind-boggling. You won't be able to predict the benefits that we'll get, but they will be many. And there will be another program after that, right? It'll be children of X generation of whatever that next program will be that'll go on to Mars and further. So it's just exciting to see that play out like it played out in the 60s and 70s.
Right, and just like before, the residual technology from these endeavors we're still benefiting from today. So even if you don't necessarily even if your passion doesn't necessarily reside in the stars, but resides with anything else interest tech-wise, be excited about the kind of things that are coming. That are those residual technologies. If nothing else, get your kids interested in what kind of smartphones they're going to be using 20 years from now. That's to be.
Yeah, well, as I like to point out again, 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program that got us to the moon, but only 12 people got to walk on the moon, right? Mm-hmm. So the vast majority of those people were here on Earth, getting paid, developing careers, developing cutting edge technology, having fulfilling lives. Everyone who was involved in that program, when you talk to them, feels like without their contribution, we never would have gotten to the moon. And coming together on a goal like that and working together on something that big has a phenomenal impact on the overall society. So future space programs do that now as well. And we'll see what those future generations realize for us.
Okay. Well, sorry, my computer's notifying me about a number of things right now. But what's next for you in terms of what new writing projects do you have underway?
Well, I've dabbled in both fiction and nonfiction. I've always written poetry. I was actually a poetry creative writing student in undergrad. I've published a book called Human Mechanics. And so I am actually working on a piece of historical fiction set in the Northwest Territory during the prairie pirate days of the 1800s, before states like Indiana and Illinois were formed. And started out in just researching for a project, and developed into a number of fascinating characters during that time who spun some yarns and tales that are, I think, fascinating, but also forgotten. We think of the Old West stories as of being out in Montana, out during the California Gold Rush days, but we forget about the fascinating stories of Indian battles and westward expansion right here in our backyard in the Midwest. So I'm working on a project there. And then as far as space is concerned, there's a character that appears in Marketing the Moon, and a person, a real person who appears in Marketing the Moon and appears in The Ultimate Engineer that was central to how we viewed the space program. And I am putting together, I won't name them yet, but I'm working on a biography of that person and making a proposal on that. So probably in the next couple of years, you'll see another backstory biography by me of a central figure of the space program coming out in the next couple of years.
And I guess you'll keep collecting items as well, like the $2 bills.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's going to be funny because, you know, you can, some days it's hit or miss when you try and pay for something with a $2 bill. The cashier behind the register might think you're trying to pull something over with them. If you definitely tell them, oh, come on, it's been to space. No, they'll know.
Well, you know, it's one of the reasons I think people collect them is because they never spend them because they view them as so unusual, right? There's no place for it in the drawer of a cash register. When people get them, they have a perception that they're rare, even though they're not. And so some people look at them as good luck talismans. Other people look at them as bad luck. And so I'm eternally fascinated with not only the $2 bill as a piece of currency, but the lore behind it and the history behind it. And the fact that they flew on over 12 space missions during Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, and even into private space over all those years, connects a dot for me and transcends just the fact that it's a piece of paper or a piece of currency. It's something that universally we all feel and share that connection to the $2 bill. So yeah, I'll keep collecting.
Okay. Well, Richard, thanks today for taking part in this conversation. It's been an interesting one. Hope this is just one more thing of what some of our alumni are out there doing. Even you know, even if they studied poetry in school, you could expand on that with a lot of things.
My son's an aeronautical engineer down at Purdue and in Indiana, and I remind him, and I remind his colleagues, you know, the poets helped get us to space too, right? And some of the engineers like George Lowe only worked in engineering, dirty hands engineering, for a short period of time in their career. Outside of that, they leveraged all their communication skills, their managerial skills, and the other disciplines you learn in college. So don't shortchange the poets. They have a lot to offer us in space as well as in literature.
Well, that's right. Don't shortchange the poets, and don't shortchange the marketers who will help you sell the story as well. Rich, thanks for taking some time with us today. I enjoyed the conversation, and everyone, thanks for joining us as well. We hope you have a good weekend.
Yep, you too, and go Salukis.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.